Come in quietly if you like. No need to knock, no need to hurry your thoughts. I'll be here, waiting, ready to share a fragment of sky and the hush of a question that has no end. There is something about tonight that makes the edges of ordinary things blur just enough to feel like the beginning of a small wonder. Maybe it's the way the air holds its breath before a soft rain, or the way a moth flickers past the lamp like a wandering star. I want to tell you a story about what the sky might be trying to say when we pretend not to hear it. It won't shout. It won't rush. It will sit beside you like a companion who knows your mind drifts when the world is too loud. If you ever feel the need to drift away for a moment, that's fine too. The weather doesn't mind if you come and go. It's patient like that. And if you want to listen more deeply, you can always come back and find me right here. Now, wherever you are, on your porch, at your desk, wrapped in a blanket by a window, take a breath and let your eyes wander to a quiet corner of the night. Let's see what the sky is whispering tonight. It began with a door that never fully closed and a question that never fully formed. I stepped inside the lab on an evening that tasted faintly of copper and rain, the kind of air that makes you feel like the weather is just waiting to be noticed. The sleepy lab wasn't really supposed to be there. Maps didn't mark it. Most people forgot the path that led to its door, a narrow foot trail half hidden behind shrubs that brushed your arms with the memory of storms long past. I found it by following a breeze that knew more than I did. Or maybe I was just ready to be found by something that wouldn't ask too many questions about where I'd been or why I'd come. I pushed the door open and it sighed, letting out a warmth that smelled of old paper and the ghost of chemical experiments that never really went wrong but never quite worked either. The walls were lined with tall cabinets, whose drawers didn't always open, but hinted at secrets tucked in the quiet hum of forgotten weather balloons and glass slides dotted with tiny flakes of snow trapped decades ago. At the center of it all was an old wooden table pressed against a window that refused to close all the way. Through the crack, a thin whistle of wind slipped in, carrying with it the smell of pine needles and the soft threat of distant thunder. I set down my bag beside a stool that wobbled under my weight and brushed the dust from a telescope that looked as though it had not tasted a star in years. There was a notebook too, thick and softened by the oils of other hands that had opened it in the dark. Its pages held sketches of cloud formations mapped like constellations, diagrams that looped and tangled in ways that only made sense if you stopped trying so hard to understand them. In that first hour, I found myself reading aloud questions that made no demands for answers. How old is a breeze when it finds your skin? Where does light sleep when the sun has nowhere to be? Can a raindrop remember where it was born? I read them softly to the walls, to the moths clinging to the bulb above me, to the faint creak of the rafters shifting in the cool breath of night. Outside the window the trees leaned in, as if they too were curious about the shape of these questions. I could hear the steady hush of wind sifting through pine branches, a language older than any book I'd studied. I rested my elbows on the sill and let my eyes adjust to the gathering dusk. A single star pulsed between drifting clouds, not brighter than the others, but closer to the edge of my thoughts somehow. It reminded me that light travels through unthinkable miles only to land softly on the back of an eyelid, turning invisible into seen, turning the cold vacuum of space into something warm enough to wish upon. I wondered then if the sky grows weary of being watched without being heard. We spend so much time cataloging its movements, predicting its moods, marking its cycles on calendars pinned to our kitchen walls. But what if it aches for us to listen, truly listen, not for warnings of rain or signs of fair weather, but for the simple fact that it is speaking at all. I traced my finger along the window glass, gathering the cool beads of condensation that formed where warm lab air met the outside chill. The drop ran down like a slow comet on a tiny journey of its own. I thought about the first droplets that ever fell on this earth, millions of years before my voice could read a question out loud. How they gathered heat, released it, held it close, let it go. The weather is the original storyteller, shaping rivers, feeding forests, carving out mountains grain by grain. And here I was, sitting in a forgotten corner of an old lab, pretending I could learn its secrets with ink and paper. A floorboard cracked behind me. Just the building settling into the night, I told myself, though some part of me liked to imagine the lab itself was alive, clearing its throat to remind me it was listening too. I flipped the page and found a scribbled note tucked between observations on wind currents and air pressure. It said only this: the sky forgets nothing. I sat with that thought for a long while, my fingers pressed to the soft edge of the paper, as if I might warm the ink back into life. Somewhere beyond the trees, an owl called out, its voice round and hollow, a perfect echo of my own wandering mind. I stayed like that until my eyes grew heavy, the telescope still untouched, the notebook now resting beneath my head. Sleep drifted in through the cracked window, carrying the scent of earth still damp from a rain that must have fallen far away and sent its story here on the shoulders of a restless breeze. I dreamt of cirrus clouds stretching thin fingers across an indifferent moon, of thunderstorms pacing the horizon like old watchmen, of a single flake of snow falling into the ocean and dissolving into salt and memory. When I woke, dawn had slipped its first pale fingers through the window gap. The sky outside was a soft bruise of blue and rose, already pulling its new stories together for the day ahead. I sat up slowly, the floor cold against my bare feet, and pressed my palm to the window pane. In the distance, the windmills turned lazily on the ridge, blades catching the newborn light. I whispered thank you to no one in particular, and listened for an answer I didn't expect to come in words. When I returned to the sleepy lab the next evening, the path felt different beneath my steps, as if the earth had shifted a little to make room for this small ritual. The air carried a warmth that clung to my skin even after the sun slipped behind the ridge, leaving only a few streaks of orange tangled in the silhouettes of pine. I paused by the observatory dome, tilting my head to glimpse the first stars teasing their way through the blue. It struck me how patient they are, these pinpricks of ancient fire that wait for dusk to hush the day before they announce themselves, not with fanfare, but with the quiet confidence of things that know they have always been here and always will be. I wondered what stories they told themselves before we came along to draw lines between them, and give them names that never quite fit. The lab door opened more easily this time, as if it remembered the shape of my hand. Inside, the air was cooler than I had left it, carrying the soft tang of old books and that faint metallic promise of rain still lingering somewhere just out of reach. I set my bag down on the same wobbly stool and crossed to the telescope, brushing away the thin film of dust that had already settled again. Outside the cracked window, I could hear the steady chant of crickets and the distant murmur of a stream finding its way downhill. I turned the telescope toward a patch of sky that seemed to shimmer with possibility, and leaned close until the cold metal ring pressed an imprint around my eye. The stars were there, patient and precise, each one a flicker of a story older than any word I knew. Through the lens they felt nearer yet impossibly far, reminders that the distance between seeing and touching can be both comfort and ache all at once. I found myself thinking about light, and how it carries messages we can't read with our eyes alone. How the photons that strike the back of my eye tonight began their journey before this lab was ever built, before this patch of earth had a name, before the questions in my notebook took shape in ink. Every glance skyward is a letter open long after it was sent. Some stars are already gone, but their light goes on telling us they're still here. A soft deception I find oddly comforting. Maybe we're all just trying to keep shining a little longer than we should, sending pieces of ourselves out into the dark in hopes that someone, somewhere, will look up and feel less alone. I adjusted the focus until a single point of light flared sharp and clear. Vega, if my memory served me right. Bright and bold and humming with distance. I liked to think it was humming. It made the sky feel more like a living thing, and less like a cold stage we stand beneath for a while before slipping quietly off the edge. My breath fogged the eyepiece, so I pulled back and let the telescope stand guard over the night without me for a moment. On the table, the notebook lay open to a page I hadn't written yet. Its blank lines waited without judgment, a patient invitation to wonder aloud in ink. I remembered a line I had read somewhere, maybe scribbled in the margin of another book left behind by another curious mind. The atmosphere is not a shield but a story. I whispered it to the window glass, and liked how it sounded there, soft and unfinished. If the atmosphere is a story, then every breeze is a sentence, every gust a paragraph, every storm an urgent exclamation that shakes trees by the roots to make sure we're still paying attention. The lab creaked around me like a ship settling into deep water. I imagined it drifting gently on a sea of grass and wind, its windows catching bits of passing sky like nets catching fish that glint and flicker before slipping back into the dark. The crickets paused and resumed their song as if in agreement with my thoughts, tiny voices weaving through the silence with a rhythm older than language. I pressed my palm flat against the table's wood, feeling its cool firmness anchor me to this moment, this small room, this small question that refused to stay small for long. Outside, a breeze found its way through the cracked window and tugged at the edge of a loose page pinned to the corkboard above the sink. I rose and gently freed it before it could slip away into the night. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded but legible. Someone had sketched a spiral, perhaps a cyclone or a galaxy, it was hard to tell, and underneath in neat block letters was a single thought: patterns repeat because they remember. I read it again, letting the words settle against my ribs where they might stay warm until I needed them. Patterns repeat because they remember. I thought about the spiral of a snail shell, the swirl of a hurricane, the unfurling arms of the Milky Way, all turning slowly in a dance that does not ask for permission to continue. Maybe the wind that rattles the lab's old windows tonight remembers another night a century ago when someone else stood here, asking the same quiet questions into the hush. I folded the paper and tucked it between the pages of my notebook as if it were a letter meant just for me. I wondered if someone would find it again long after I was gone, wondering if they too would feel the soft weight of being connected to a thought that never really belonged to anyone at all. I sat back down and leaned my head against the cool plaster wall, letting my gaze drift up to the ceiling where cracks mapped tiny rivers that branched and split and rejoined in ways that made me think of tributaries flowing toward a hidden sea. The building sighed, or maybe it was just me, exhaling a breath I hadn't known I was holding. I closed my eyes and listened to the quiet tick of the clock on the far shelf, its second hand moving in a steady loop, unbothered by whether I noticed or not. In that moment, I thought of all the moments stacked behind this one like pages of weather records locked away in dusty cabinets. Storms measured and filed away in neat columns. Temperatures noted with an exactness that never quite captured how the air really felt against your skin when you stepped outside to greet the dawn. Data tells a story, but never the whole one. That's why the sleepy lab still hums at night. A soft promise that what we can't measure might still be worth listening to. I think maybe that's why I come here. Not to find answers that fit into tidy graphs, but to feel the shape of questions that expand when spoken into the quiet. I looked back through the window one last time before gathering my things, the stars still waiting, patient and bright, a reminder that even when the lab stands empty, the conversation goes on. By the third evening, the path felt like it knew my footsteps. It no longer resisted but welcomed them, the loose gravel and soft weeds parting beneath my boots without protest. The air was cooler this time, brushed with the distant promise of frost, and the trees whispered overhead as if they carried secrets in their needles. I paused at the old observatory dome, touching its rusted skin with my fingertips, feeling the way the metal held the day's warmth like an old stone hearth. I wondered who last looked through its giant eye at the sweep of the cosmos, and whether they too had stood there afterward, hands in pockets, listening to the hum that lingers in a place built for looking far beyond itself. The sleepy lab waited beyond the dome, half swallowed by shadow, its single light flickering behind the cracked window. It greeted me the way an old dog might, without fuss but with an unmistakable sense of recognition. I slipped inside and let the door sigh shut behind me, setting my bag on the stool, which no longer wobbled under my weight as much as it once did. Maybe it too had settled into my presence, or maybe the lab had found a way to hold itself still for me. The air tonight smelled faintly of ozone, the ghost of a storm that had passed somewhere upriver. On the table lay the notebook, exactly where I left it, as if no time had passed at all, though the dust motes shifting in the thin beam of my lamp suggested otherwise. I flipped it open and found my folded scrap of spiral still tucked between the pages, its crease deeper now, the paper worn soft at the edges like a stone polished in a pocket. I traced the lines of the spiral with my finger and thought of the river that must be running high tonight, fed by rains that fell days ago in a place I would never stand. The water's journey was not so different from the winds or the lights, carrying whispers of distant hills to the low valleys, carving stories in sediment and silt, leaving behind patterns that repeat because they remember. I liked that thought and let it sit at the edge of my mind as I moved to the telescope by the window. I pointed it west this time, where the sky was darkest, heavy with stars that seemed to crowd together like villagers gathered around a fire. I could almost feel their warmth, an illusion born of imagination but comforting all the same. Through the eyepiece, I found a patch of darkness cut by the faint smear of a nebula, a drifting nursery of gas and dust where new stars would someday pull themselves together and burn their first quiet promises into the waiting dark. I watched the shape for a long while, my breath misting the glass each time I leaned too close, my heart beating slower as if to match the hush of light taking its time. Somewhere beneath me, the floor creaked and settled, the lab's old bones adjusting to the night-shifting air. When I pulled back, the sky outside the cracked window seemed closer, pressing its cool face to the glass. I thought of the first people to name the constellations, how they must have stood in open fields with cold grass brushing their ankles, weaving stories from dots of fire no closer than they are now. I wondered if they felt small or vast when they looked up, whether the sight comforted them or made them ache with the distance. Maybe it did both. Maybe that's why we keep naming the stars again and again, as if giving them shape in our mouths keeps them tethered to us for just a while longer. I sat back on the stool, the notebook open on my knees, my pencil moving without much thought at first, just loose lines and half-finished sentences that drifted together like scattered leaves finding the same current. The lab's clock ticked somewhere behind me, the soft swing of its hand reminding me that time here was more suggestion than rule. Outside, the breeze nudged the cracked window, sending a curl of cold air across my face. I closed my eyes and let it pass, imagining the wind's path over the ridge, through the black pines, skimming the surface of the stream that ran its quiet course down to the valley below. I pictured the water surface catching starlight and carrying it on its rippling back like a secret never quite spoken aloud. I wondered how many words drift unspoken through the world each night, caught in leaves, tucked into river stones, waiting for someone willing to listen without expecting an answer. When I opened my eyes, the lab seemed softer somehow, its corners blurred by the low lamp's glow, the shadows pooled like dark ink in the places I hadn't explored yet. There were drawers I hadn't opened, cabinets whose locks had long ago given up holding secrets, but still refused to yield without a gentle coaxing. I crossed to one such cabinet and tugged until the latch clicked free. Inside, paper stacked like old snow, brittle and tinged at the edges with the brown memory of many seasons. I pulled out a folder at random and sat cross-legged on the floor, the wood cold but grounding beneath me. The pages within were covered in looping script, observations on wind patterns and cloud formations, dated in a neat hand from decades before I first stepped through the lab's door. There were sketches, too, billowing shapes shaded in pencil, arrows marking movement as if the sky's restless mind could be pinned down on paper. I ran my finger along the dates, imagining the person who wrote them sitting right where I sat now, perhaps listening to the same creak in the ceiling, the same soft whisper of wind finding its way inside. I like to think that curiosity threads us together, binding one set of questions to the next so that none of us is ever really alone with our wonderings. I closed the folder and slid it back into place, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of its neighbors. When I stood, my knees popped like old wood, and I laughed softly at the sound echoing in the quiet room. Even small noises feel bigger here, as if the lab wants to keep them safe so they do not disappear too quickly into the silence. Returning to the table, I wrote a single line across the fresh page of my notebook. All things drift, but some come back. I wasn't sure if I believed it, but it felt good to write, the pencil pressing thought into paper in a way that felt more certain than saying it out loud. Outside, the night deepened, the stars more numerous now, crowding the edges of my window with their cold ancient eyes. I watched them for a while longer, the breeze slipping in to tug at my hair, carrying with it the soft hiss of leaves turning over in their sleep. The fourth night arrived wrapped in a hush, so complete it felt as if the world had agreed to pause its breath just long enough for me to slip through unnoticed. The air carried a crisp edge, the first whisper of a deeper cold yet to come, and as I walked the narrow path toward the sleepy lab my boots left a soft trail in the frost forming along the grass. Overhead the sky was unbroken and dark, a sweep of velvet freckled with pinpoints that pulsed as if in conversation with themselves. Somewhere a branch snapped under the quiet weight of a small creature, and for a moment I felt like an intruder in my own ritual, but the thought passed as quickly as it came carried away by the rustle of needles overhead. The observatory dome loomed against the starlight, the metal ribs catching faint glimmers, like a lantern whose flame had long ago gone cold, but still knew how to hold a glow. I paused beside it, and pressed my palm to the curve of its wall, feeling the skin of night hum faintly through the old iron. I wondered if metal remembers warmth the way stone does, if it holds the echo of every hand that ever rested there, every night spent tracing constellations that have since drifted or blurred or slipped behind the next horizon. The lab door greeted me with a sigh familiar now in its tone, like the soft exhale of a companion glad for my return. Inside, the air was colder than the nights before. The window's stubborn gap had welcomed the chill without resistance. My breath formed a small cloud that drifted toward the ceiling before dissolving into the beams. The lamp on the table flickered when I nudged its switch, then settled into a steady glow that left the corners of the room in gentle shadow. I set my bag down and shrugged off my coat, draping it over the back of the chair that had become mine in a way that felt both comforting and undeserved. The notebook waited open, its last line still fresh from where my pencil had lifted days before. All things drift, but some come back. I read it twice, letting the words find their echo in the hush that folded itself around my shoulders. Tonight, I did not go to the telescope right away. Instead, I moved to the cabinet I had left unopened the time before, the one that sat lower to the floor, its brass handle tarnished to a dull green by years of damp air. It resisted at first, though it swollen around its frame, but a gentle tug freed it, and inside I found stacks of thin boxes bound with string. I lifted one and carried it to the table, sliding the loop of string free with the care of someone unwrapping something fragile and precious. Inside were glass slides, each one labeled in a neat script with dates and times and brief notations that meant little to me at first glance. I held one to the lamp's light, tilting it until a thin frost of crystalline pattern caught the glow. A snowflake preserved decades ago, maybe longer, its delicate arm still branching in perfect symmetry, a fleeting moment of cold captured and made permanent by hands long gone. I lined 3 more along the edge of the notebook, each one a tiny testament to the patient practice of paying attention. To look so closely at something so easily melted seemed to me a quiet kind of rebellion against the world's insistence that small things slip away unnoticed. I thought of the snow that must be gathering on higher peaks tonight, how each flake tumbles through layers of air, shifting from warm to colder, still shaping itself according to the whim of wind and the memory of the water it once was. I wondered if each flake feels unique before it joins the drift, or if it knows it is part of something larger, a soft blanket that hushes the ground and makes even the loudest footsteps careful. I placed the slides back in their box, winding the string once more around its spine and returning it to the cabinet, its place unchanged despite my brief borrowing. Some part of me envied that small permanence, the way the lab could hold pieces of weather in neat rows, while outside the wind scattered the rest without apology or plan. When I finally turned to the telescope, the eyepiece was cold against my cheek, the metal stealing warmth from my skin even as it offered me a patch of sky deeper than my eyes could reach alone. Tonight I traced the edge of the moon, where its shadow blurred into the black its surface, a pock history of collisions and silence. I imagined the first astronomers, who looked through crude lenses to see its mountains and valleys, mapping places they would never stand. I let my thoughts drift further outward, slipping past the moon to the sweep of stars that spilled behind it, light from so far away. It had begun its journey before my name existed, before this lab existed, before the hands that built its walls ever shaped the stones that hold it steady on this hill. I pulled back and rested my elbows on the table, my breath warming the pages of the notebook as I leaned close. My pencil found its rhythm without needing my full attention, tracing the curve of the moon, then letting lines drift outward into loops that hinted at orbits and tides and the slow pull of gravity that keeps us all from drifting too far from what we know. I wondered how much of weather is the Earth's way of remembering its own shape, the wind shaping dunes and drifts and waves that rise and fall with the same patient breath. I wondered, too, if we listen closely enough, or if the rush of our days drowns out the small reminders, the soft pulse of air that asks only to be noticed. A draft tugged at my collar, reminding me that the window would never quite shut, and maybe that was a kindness. The world must slip in if it's to be understood. I rose and crossed to stand beside the gap, pressing my palm against the frame, where the cold seeped in unbothered by my efforts to hold it back. Beyond the glass the trees swayed gently, their shadows swaying with them, a slow dance that never asks for applause. Somewhere an owl called its low question into the dark, and I answered in my mind without words, just an acknowledgement that I heard and that I would keep listening. When my eyes grew heavy, I returned to the chair, drawing my coat around my shoulders and letting my gaze drift to the pages before me. The pencil rolled from my fingers, landing with a soft clatter that seemed louder than it should have in the hush. The clock ticked on its backward drift, the hour hand steady, the minute hand a reminder that time here did not demand my obedience, only my patience. I closed my eyes and let my breathing match the rhythm of the lab's soft creaks, the distant rustle of wind through pine, the heartbeat of a place that asked for nothing but my quiet company. Sleep found me there the same way it always did, slipping in through the crack of the window and settling against my eyelids, carrying with it the scent of frost and the soft promise that tomorrow the questions would remain exactly where I left them, waiting without hurry, without end. Morning came slowly and without fuss, slipping its pale fingers through the stubborn window crack and landing on the corner of my notebook like a soft reminder that time does not stop even when we pretend it might inside these walls. I woke with the ache of wood pressed into my cheek, the chair's hard edge leaving a faint mark that would fade long before the questions I had dreamt of did. The sleepy lab was still wrapped in its hush, but outside I could sense the world was already shifting from night to day, a subtle brightening that pulled me from the warmth of my coat and into the chill that drifted across the floor. I stood and stretched my arms above my head, feeling the stiffness unwind in my shoulders, the way a branch might loosen under the first touch of sunlight. For a moment I listened to the faint hum that always seemed to live in the corners of the lab, an old melody of wood and stone and air moving through narrow cracks. It made me wonder if buildings could dream the way we do, if somewhere behind the walls the lab replayed every whisper, every footstep, every soft click of a pencil against a page. I opened the notebook to where my last thoughts had trailed off, a swirl of half-drawn orbits and a few words that looked almost like they belonged to someone else, written in the drifting hand of sleep. I traced them with my finger, not to understand them exactly, but to remind myself that thoughts sometimes make sense only after they have been given enough space to breathe. I closed the book and carried it with me to the cracked window, leaning my elbows on the sill and peering out into a world that looked softer under the early light. A thin mist hovered in the trees, blurring their edges until they seemed less like solid trunks and more like sketches still deciding what shape to take. Somewhere below the rise of the hill the stream murmured its steady promise, a ribbon of sound that tied the lab to the valley below. I imagined the water carrying fragments of sky in its surface, stars reflected and broken by the current, then gathered again when the surface stilled further downstream. I liked the thought, the way something so vast could be held in something so small, if only for a moment. I found myself thinking about how weather is not just something that happens above us, but something we carry within us too. The warmth of our breath meeting the cold air, the soft salt of sweat on skin under the sun, the way our own pulse can quicken like a sudden gust or slow like falling snow. I wondered if the scientists who once filled these rooms knew that when they mapped the wind they were also mapping a part of themselves, their questions drifting into the atmosphere to settle in places they might never stand. I stepped back from the window and ran my hand along the edge of the table that would cool under my palm, its grain worn smooth by the elbows, and notebooks of countless nights just like this one. The telescope stood waiting, its lens aimed at a patch of ceiling, as if resting between visions. I pulled it gently back toward the window, turning it steady eye toward the brightening sky, knowing that even in daylight there were things to see if one looked with the right kind of patience. Through the glass the sky was a pale wash of blue brushed with the faintest hint of cirrus clouds stretched so thin they seemed like breath exhaled by the horizon. I adjusted the focus and found nothing remarkable at first, just the soft blur of light and a single drifting speck that might have been dust on the lens, but shifted when I held my breath and watched closer. A bird perhaps, or a scrap of seed caught on an updraft riding the invisible stairs that lift small things higher than they ever meant to climb. I thought of how fragile flight is, how much of it depends on currents we cannot see, how even the strongest wing must trust the air to hold it up. I wondered if the first people to watch birds understood the air as something alive, something with moods and memories, shifting pockets of warmth and cold that could cradle or betray with equal ease. I stepped away from the telescope and crossed to the cabinet I had opened the night before, my fingers finding the edge of another box tucked behind the others, this one heavier, wrapped not in string, but in a thin strip of faded cloth. I unwound it carefully, feeling the grit of old dust in the weave, and inside found a small collection of stones, each one labeled with a date and a place written in the same looping hand as the slides. River stones, mostly smooth and pale, one flecked with what looked like mica that caught the lamp's light in a tiny flash like a distant star. I turned them over in my palm, feeling their cool weight, thinking about how long they had waited in water to be found. Erosion, they would have called it in the old notebooks, but I like to think of it more as remembering each sharp edge softened, not lost, but transformed by the patient conversation between stone and water. I lined the stones along the table in the order they had been marked, imagining the journeys they had made to find each other here in this box, in this lab, waiting for hands like mine to lift them back into the light. I left the stones where they were and moved to the far wall where a small map had been pinned so long ago, its corners curled inward like dry leaves. It showed no roads, no towns, only contour lines tracing the rise and fall of hills, rivers marked in thin blue veins drifting toward the margins, where they vanished into the edge of the page. Someone had dotted tiny ink circles at irregular intervals, each labeled with a date that hinted at storms or floods, or perhaps nights like this, when the air pressed secrets into the skin of paper. I ran my finger along the lines, feeling the roughness of old thumbtacks that held the map in place, and wondered how many seasons had changed since it was last read with real intent. I thought about how maps are promises, in a way, a belief that if we name something, trace its shape, pin it down, we might better understand it. Yet the rivers shift, the wind shifts, the snow melts and gathers again, and the map remains fixed, holding what was true only for a moment. I returned to my chair, pulling the notebook into my lap and writing down these small thoughts, not because they needed to be captured, but because I needed the act of capturing them, the gentle drag of pencil across paper, the way the words tethered my drifting mind to this place, this hour. Outside, the mist began to lift, revealing the darker shapes of tree trunks and the pale spark of frost still clinging to shaded patches of grass. I thought about leaving then, but the lab held me a little longer, its quiet weight settling around my shoulders like a wool blanket fresh from the chill. I closed my eyes and listened to the creak of. I spent the day with the quiet restlessness that follows me when I step away from the lab, carrying its soft questions in my chest like the slow swell of a tide. Even as I moved through the small patterns of my waking hours, the lab's hush lingered at the edges of my thoughts, pulling me back toward the path that winds behind the old observatory and slips into that hidden pocket of waiting air. I noticed things more than usual, the slight bend of branches under the afternoon wind, the way a thin cloud drifted apart and reformed above the hills, the rhythm of my own breath fogging against a window when I paused too close. It made the hours feel longer, and yet, When dusk gathered itself on my doorstep, it felt sudden, like a hand at my shoulder reminding me of an unfinished sentence. So I returned my boots, scuffing the loose gravel in a new pattern, the trees overhead greeting me in their language of sighs and rustles. The dome rose up through the dusk, pale and patient, its ribs touched by the faint wash of moonlight that had slipped into the sky before the sun was fully gone. I brushed my fingers over the cold metal as I passed, feeling how it held the chill as easily as it once held heat, and I wondered again if anything truly forgets. The lab's door gave its usual soft complaint as I pushed it open and stepped inside, but tonight the air felt different, crisper yet somehow softer, as if the building itself had settled deeper into its own secret breathing. I set my bag down on the stool, which seemed sturdier every night, and let my eyes adjust to the thin circle of light spilling from the small lamp on the table. The stones from the box still lined the edge of the table exactly where I had left them, their surfaces catching flecks of lamplight and throwing them back at me like tiny stars. I found myself tracing their shapes with my fingertips one by one, feeling the subtle grit where time and water had worked their patient edges smooth. There was something reassuring in their silence, a reminder that small things persist even when the larger world rearranges itself again and again. I turned one over in my palm, the mica glint catching my eye before I set it gently back in line with the others, as if they might feel lost without each other's company. Tonight, I did not open the notebook right away. Instead, I went to the window and leaned against its frame, letting the cold slip into the sleeve of my sweater until my skin prickled awake. The sky outside was clear enough that the stars seemed closer, more insistent in their flicker. I let my eyes drift among them, following no pattern, no constellation, just the scatter that has guided more thoughts than any map ever drawn. Somewhere beyond the rise of the hill, the river moved under its thin skin of ice, carrying the memory of the clouds that fed it long before this winter came. I could almost hear its hush if I held my breath long enough, a faint threading of sound that reached me even through glass and wood. I closed my eyes and let that sound braid itself into the pulse at my temple, the steady hush of water meeting the slower hush of thought. When I turned back, the telescope waited like an old friend whose stories never run dry. I eased it toward a corner of sky where I knew a cluster rested just beyond the reach of my unaided sight, and leaned in until the cold ring kissed my cheekbone. The lens brought the stars closer, not to touch, but to see better, to feel the depth behind the flicker. I thought about the space between what we see and what is there, how light can bridge a gap so vast that my mind folds in on itself, trying to hold the scale. Each star a point of heat, so far gone yet still here. Each breath I exhaled fogged the lens slightly, so I paused and waited, watching the shapes settle into focus again, each small flare reminding me that the sky is never empty, it only waits for us to look carefully enough to be filled. Pulling back, I sat at the table again, and finally opened the notebook, letting its blank page greet me without urgency. My pencil hovered above the paper, while I listened to the lab's small symphony, the faint creak of the ceiling beam, the soft scratch of wind along the window's edge, the slow tick of the backward clock marking time in its stubborn way. I wrote a single line across the top of the page: the river carries the sky on its back. The words looked fragile alone, so I let the pencil wander again, adding loops that might be currents or wind patterns, or maybe just the drifting shapes my mind makes when it is free to move without instruction. I thought of how the wind finds its way around obstacles, always moving, always adjusting, never asking permission to change direction. How maybe we could learn from that, how maybe I was already learning by sitting here night after night, letting my questions bend and curl like the air outside this small room. My hand moved without plan, drawing a thin arc across the page, and then another crossing at the shape reminding me of the paths birds trace when they ride the thermals above the ridge, their wings tilting to catch the invisible lift. I wondered how much they know about what holds them up, whether they feel the same soft trust that I do when I stand under the sky and let it rest against my face. The pencil fell silent for a moment while I listened to the scratch of a branch against the window, sharp but somehow comforting in its insistence that the outside world was never far. I turned my head to watch the shadows it cast across the wall, shapes that shifted with each gust, each small push of air, a reminder that weather is never still, no matter how quiet it seems when we forget to look. I rose and crossed to the cabinet again, feeling drawn to its deeper drawers, the ones I had not yet opened, as if the answers I did not know I was asking might wait there, tucked behind old files and brittle folders. One drawer resisted but gave way with a groan, revealing a shallow tray lined with more slides, these darker than the snowflakes from nights ago. Each held thin layers of something that caught the light in iridescent shimmers, oil perhaps, or film from water left to dry, and trapped the colors hidden in its surface tension. I held one to the lamp, tilting it slowly, and watched the rainbow spread along its edge the same way an oil slick stretches its thin skin across a puddle after rain. I thought about how light bends through such simple things. By the time I found my way back, the snow had thickened its hush into every corner of the path, softening the sound of my boots until it felt as though I might simply vanish into the drift and leave no trace behind. The air tasted different, colder, but not sharp, just full enough that every breath carried the faint bite of ice on the tongue, a reminder that the sky did not only look down on me, but found its way inside with every exhale. I paused near the observatory dome, resting my palm on its cold curve, letting the flakes land and melt on the back of my hand like small confessions offered without explanation. The dome seemed to lean closer tonight, its metal skin catching the dim spill of starlight that slipped through breaks in the cloud cover above, and I thought about how much sky must have passed through its eye before I ever stood beneath it, how many nights were spent here long before my questions were written down in any notebook at all. The lab's roof showed the soft weight of snow now to each drift, following the angle of old shingles that had seen storms gentler, and storms far more cruel than this one, and yet still stood waiting to hold the hush of the night in its rafters. When I pushed the door open, the warmth inside felt less like heat and more like memory, the way the walls seemed to fold around me, as if they recognized the cold on my shoulders, and pulled it away piece by piece. The lamp flickered as I passed my hand near its switch, before blooming into that soft glow I had grown to trust more than any clock on these evenings that stretched and drifted in ways time outside the lab never could. I left my coat draped over the back of the chair, brushing free a few clinging flakes that melted and darkened the old wood where they'd landed. The notebook waited just as I had left it, its cover slightly bowed from the pages I had filled with loops and lines and small thoughts that rarely ended where they began. I flipped it open and let my eyes rest on the last line, "The sky never leaves, it only changes shape," and felt the simple truth of it settle like a stone in my palm. Tonight the wind found a way in through the stubborn window gap, carrying with it the smallest hush of snow, drifting in tiny specks that melted as they touched the sill, leaving behind thin beads of water that traced slow paths toward the edge of the frame. I pressed my fingertips into the chill, and then turned to the telescope, lifting its barrel to meet a break in the clouds where a handful of stars pulsed clear and steady against the dark. I leaned in my breast shallow, so as not to fog the lens, and let my eye find those distant lights once more, each one a soft anchor that made the vast space between feel less like emptiness and more like a quiet waiting. I thought of how light travels so far to arrive here, And how when I look I am not just seeing what is, but what was a memory carried across distances that would swallow me whole in an instant if I ever tried to cross them. I like that contradiction that something so immense could be caught for a moment in the small circle of a lens and an eye and a heartbeat. I stepped back and let the telescope hold its vigil while I moved to the cabinet, again drawn to the quiet puzzle of what lay behind its closed drawers. This time I chose one I had not yet opened, near the bottom, where the wood had darkened from years of drafts and the small leaks that slipped through the roof during storms long past. The drawer stuck at first, then slid free with a reluctant sigh, and inside I found a shallow wooden tray lined with yellowing paper dotted with rows of tiny vials, each stoppered tight with wax that had cracked and flaked with age. I lifted one, holding it to the lamp's glow, and turned it gently in my palm, the liquid inside shifting like a captured moment of rain. There were notes folded beneath the tray corners, soft from fingers that had unfolded and folded them again countless times. I laid the paper flat on the table and read the careful script, faded, but still strong enough to speak a message across the years. Condensation from storm front, delta north wind, cold front over ridge, sample gathered first, thaw. The word simple, but alive with the hush of someone trying to catch weather in a bottle. I thought about that, how someone before me had stood where I stood now, their breath forming the same soft clouds in the winter air, their hands cold and steady as they sealed a drop of storm inside glass and wax, believing that somehow, in holding it still, they might hold still the sky's restless mind. I placed the vial back exactly as I found it, the wax rough against my fingertips, and closed the drawer, feeling the faint tremor of the lab settling around me again, as if acknowledging my small act of witness. At the table I sat and lifted my pencil, letting it drift across the page in lines that bent like wind currents over hills, each loop and curl more feeling than fact, a record of what it means to sit in a quiet room while the world rearranges itself just beyond the glass. The backward clock ticked its soft argument with time, the minute hand drifting away, while the hour hand pressed on, and somewhere in that gentle tug-of-war I found my own rhythm of breath, matched to the hush that snow makes when it lands on rooftops and fence rails and the old boards of an unpaved path. I wrote a line about the river beneath its new skin of ice, how it must feel the press of winter above, while below it hums with the soft pulse of water that will not be stilled no matter how thick the freeze becomes. I wrote about the sound of wind through pine, and how even the needles remember the shape of storms, bending without breaking, whispering without ever raising their voices too high. I paused once to listen, really listen to the way the lab seemed to breathe around me, the creak of its bones, the low shift of old beams, the way the wind rattled the latch of the window, but never quite forced its way completely in. I thought then of the first time I found this place, how I had stepped inside without knowing what I needed, only that I needed somewhere to rest the part of my mind that never stopped asking what if and how and when. I thought about how weather is not just the story of clouds and rain, but the story of us too, our pulse, our warmth, our small invisible storms that shift the air around us with every step. I let my pencil fall quiet again, resting my hand on the open page, the paper cool beneath my skin like the surface of a pond waiting for the next ripple. I closed my eyes for a moment and felt the room around me, its hush and warmth, the draft at my ankles, the slow drift of snow against the outer wall, all of it folding into one slow thought that had no edges, only a shape that changed as I breathed. The snow stayed for days, wrapping every branch and rooftop in a hush so complete that even the sound of my own steps felt out of place when I finally returned to the path that led behind the dome. The world seemed smaller under the weight of so much white, as if the distance between here and there had folded in on itself, pulling the trees and the hill and the narrow trail all closer so I could carry them in my pocket if I wished. The sky above was a pale smear of dawn that never quite became full day, holding the sun just out of reach behind a gauze of low clouds that moved so slowly they might have been painted there by a half-forgotten brush. I let my breath leave long streams of warmth that curled and vanished against the drift of cold air curling through the gap between my collar and my neck. By the time the observatory dome came into view, its metal ribs were rimed with frost that caught the faint glow of morning in sharp needles of ice. I paused with my hand against it, feeling how the metal shared its cold with me willingly, an unspoken exchange of warmth for memory. Maybe all weather is like that, an exchange that never stops moving, heat for cold air, for breath, sky for skin. The lab's door opened with a soft crack of ice breaking along the frame, the wood swollen slightly from the cold, but yielding to the pressure of my palm. Inside, the familiar warmth felt thinner tonight, but somehow deeper, as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath, waiting for the cold outside to nudge me back through that small doorway of creaking hinges and quiet promise. I left my coat draped over the stool's back and pulled the lamp's chain to life, its glow trembling at first, then steadying into a small sun that reached only as far as the edges of the old table where the notebook waited, half open, its corner turned, as if the draft through the window had tried to read it in my absence. I flipped to the last page, tracing my fingertip along the last line where I had written about the sky changing shape, and thought about how true that felt standing here, with snow still melting along the hem of my sleeves. Outside, the wind carried the faint hiss of more snow coming, a sound that felt more like a breath than a warning. I crossed to the telescope, brushing a drift of dust from its lens cap and easing it toward the window, where the sky's low glow seemed to press its face to the glass, waiting for me to look back. Through the eyepiece, I found only the blur of cloud, a soft, endless field of shifting gray that gave up no stars, no moon, only the suggestion that beyond that veil the same points of light waited unchanged by my small waiting here. I pulled back and let the telescope rest its curved back cool beneath my palm as I leaned against it, listening to the wind press its shoulder against the lab's wall and then ease away again, like someone half decided to come in, but thinking better of it at the last moment. I liked that the wind felt alive here, more voice than force, carrying bits of the ridge and the trees and the quiet drifts of snow from slope to slope long after my footsteps had been buried behind me. Tonight, I opened the lowest drawer in the cabinet, the one I had not yet touched, and found inside a shallow wooden box, its lid loose enough to slip free without protest. Inside lay rows of small envelopes, each yellowed with age, their flaps sealed with the kind of wax that cracks at the edges when pressed too firmly. I lifted one and turned it over in my hand, feeling the grit of sand inside shifting like a distant tide made tiny enough to hold between thumb and forefinger. A faint note was written across the front: Windborne Desert Sample, South Ridge, and a date that had faded so soft it might vanish entirely if I looked too long. I imagined whoever sealed it standing on some open stretch of land miles from here, their boots pressed into warm dunes, the wind tugging at their collar as they gathered a handful of the sky's restless memory and tucked it away to be carried here to this wooden drawer, to wait for hands like mine to lift it again into the hush of a snowbound room. I set the envelope gently beside the notebook and opened a new page, letting my pencil hover above the blank space, as if the red line might drift down from the rafters to settle there without my help. I wrote about the sand, how it must have carried whispers of heat and sun even now beneath the cold roof of this winter lab, how each grain was shaped by the press of wind that never paused in its slow sculpting. I thought about the strange echo of holding desert sand in a room wrapped in snow, the contrast, so quiet yet so certain that I almost felt the grain shift warmer under my palm, as if remembering what it once was before it was gathered and hidden away. The pencil found its own drift, looping words around small sketches of dunes rising and falling in gentle arcs that reminded me of waves, which in truth they are only slower, softer tides moved by air instead of water. The lamp flickered once and steadied its small flame, catching the edge of the envelope, so its shadow fell long across my open page, a dark wave cresting over my scrawled thoughts. I thought about how shadows are just another form of weather, the way light makes the shape of absence visible, if only for a moment, the way clouds make shadows on fields so large they look like lakes drifting across the hills until the sun shifts and the lake vanishes, leaving only grass waving in the wind. I rested my pencil and leaned back in the chair, letting my eyes slip closed as the lab's small noises found me again: the tick of the backward clock, the sigh of the wind pushing a flake of snow through the stubborn window gap, the soft creak of old wood, remembering every shoulder that ever pressed against it. When I opened my eyes again, the room felt closer, as if the walls had eased inward a fraction, not to crowd, but to hold me steady in my drifting. I reached for another envelope, letting its sand whisper in its paper skin as I turned it over, and wondered if it would know the snow outside, if the warmth it carried in memory would slip into the cold if I opened it, and let the grain spill across the old wood. I did not open it, though, not yet. Instead, I tucked it back into its box, settling it among its quiet neighbors, as if they too were waiting for the right wind to carry them elsewhere. The lamp's glow caught on the frost that rimmed the window glass, and for a moment the cold outside and the warmth inside met in a thin edge of melting water that traced a slow path downward before freezing again along the sill. I closed the notebook with care, slipping my pencil between its pages to keep my place for the next drift of thought that might find me when I returned to the path before the sky had fully made up its mind about dawn, letting my boots break the new crust of snow that had fallen in the hours since I last slipped through the lab door. The air was sharp enough to wake my breath into quick clouds that drifted behind me and vanished into the branches overhead. I moved slowly because there was no reason to hurry here, each step an agreement between my weight and the soft hush beneath it. By the time I reached the dome, its ribs were almost hidden beneath a fresh skin of snow, each curve softened into a shape that looked less like metal and more like bone rising from the hill in a quiet fossil of something that once watched stars and might still remember how. I paused, my glove pressed against the frozen surface, feeling how it gave nothing back, no warmth, no sign that my touch mattered, but still I stayed for a moment, as if waiting for a secret to slip through the metal and into my fingertips. When I turned away, the wind carried a single flake into my eye, and I blinked it free, tasting the cold as it melted against my skin. The lab door looked smaller tonight, or maybe it was just the snow drifted high against its frame, a reminder that outside always tries to come in no matter how carefully we build our walls. Inside, the lamp's light seemed brighter after so much white and gray, the room folding around its soft circle of warmth like an old blanket that knew the shape of my shoulders. I set my coat across the stool's back again, shaking free the small clumps of snow that had clung to the hem and watching them pool into small dark marks on the wood before the warmth of the room erased them one by one. The notebook lay open exactly where I had left it, as if the draft through the window or the hush of settling snow had turned its pages gently in my absence to remind it what waiting meant. I traced the last line with my fingertip, the letters half smudged from where the point of my pencil had paused the night before the sand, the snow, the quiet drift between them all. I closed my eyes and listened to the wind pressing against the outside walls, the faint tap of a branch that kept its own rhythm, like a soft heartbeat echoing what I felt under my ribs. Sometimes it seemed to me the lab itself had a pulse that found mine, whenever I crossed its threshold, folding my small human warmth into the hush that lived inside these beams and boards. I pulled the telescope closer to the window, though I knew the sky tonight would show me nothing new, no stars breaking through the thick veil that sagged low enough to catch the hilltops in its damp breath. Still, I liked the weight of it under my hands, the way the cold metal steadied me, as I leaned my forehead against the barrel, letting the chill there bleed into my skin. I thought about how many eyes had looked through this lens before mine, each pair carrying its own tangle of questions, its own bright certainty that somewhere in the dark there was an answer waiting to be pinned down, like a star chart on yellowing paper. I wondered what they saw when the glass gave them nothing but cloud, if they found comfort in the blur, or frustration, or something softer that slipped between those two, like the hush between heartbeats. I pulled back and let the telescope stand guard by the window, its narrow gaze steady even when mine drifted. Tonight I felt drawn to the vials again, the tiny storms sealed in glass and wax that waited in their shallow tray like messages from a sky that never truly rests. I lifted one, holding it up to the lamp, so the liquid inside caught the light in a thin waver of reflection, the surface trembling slightly where it met the glass. A memory of rain that fell decades ago, or maybe longer, held still by someone's careful hand, and heat, and the press of wax that now cracked beneath my thumb as I turned it gently. I did not open it, but the thought that the air of this room might meet the air of that storm for the first time made something quiet shiver through my chest. Weather does not vanish, it only changes shape. A thought that had settled itself into my spine so many nights ago, and still found ways to surprise me when I looked too closely at these small fragments of kept sky. I set the vial back in its nest of paper, and opened the notebook again, letting my pencil find a fresh page, while the backward clock on the shelf ticked its soft reminder that time here does not move in the same straight line as outside. I wrote about how the snow outside knew the shape of the wind before it landed, how each flake carried the memory of the clouds that released it, how the hill remembered each drift as another layer of hush laid down over roots and stones and sleeping insects that would wake when the thaw returned. I thought about the river hidden now beneath a skin of ice, how it still spoke in the darkness beneath the freeze, its voice slowed but never silenced, carrying old leaves and bits of stone in a slow hush that would not be stopped by winter's quiet argument. I pressed the pencil harder against the page, feeling the drag of lead catching in the grain of paper, the simple anchor of words, when the wind rattled the window latch just enough to make me lift my head and listen. I crossed to the window and pressed my palm against the pane, where my warmth bloomed in a brief clear patch surrounded by frost that crept back the moment I lifted my hand away. Beyond the glass, the trees leaned under the weight of snow, their branches bending in that graceful patience that trees have learned from so many seasons of carrying what the sky gives them. I wondered if they felt the snow's hush, or if they simply held it because there was nothing else to do when the cold settles in for its slow conversation with the living wood beneath the bark. My breath fogged the glass again, and I traced a slow line through it with my fingertip, a shape that meant nothing and everything, a drift of thought caught in the moment before it vanished back into the chill. Returning to the table, I rested my elbows on its edge, letting the notebook lie open, while my eyes found the stones I had left lined in a neat row, each one holding a piece of river, or ridge, or rain-smoothed trail from seasons I would never stand inside. I lifted one, turning it over in my palm, feeling how the warmth of my skin woke the grit and smooth all at once, how the stone did not resist being held but gave up nothing more than its quiet weight. I set it down again beside the notebook and wrote about that too, how holding something does not mean knowing it entirely, how maybe the best we can do is trace the edge, feel the cool hush, press it back into the line beside its brothers, and trust that its story will wait without complaint until we are ready to ask again. I stepped through the lab door into air so still it felt like stepping into the pause between one thought and the next. The snow gathered deep enough along the path that my boots sank to the ankle with each slow step, leaving behind a soft trail that the wind did not bother to cover, at least not yet. The trees leaned closer tonight, their branches heavy under the layered hush, their needles catching what little light slipped from the sky above. There was no moon, only the dim gray glow that comes when clouds fold the night into themselves, reflecting the breath of the earth back downward in a soft, restless murmur. The observatory dome appeared in that hush, like the rounded back of some ancient creature resting in the drift, its metal bones traced in frost that sparkled where my small lantern caught it. I paused, my gloved hand pressed flat against the cold curve, feeling how the metal did not yield or warm, but instead held the silence steady like a stone holds the memory of the sun long after dusk has closed its eye. I wondered who first imagined that a dome might hold the whole sky inside its ribs, who stood beneath that curve and decided to listen closer by narrowing the vast arc to the small circle of a lens. Maybe they too paused in the hush before slipping through a door like mine, carrying a pocket of warmth to trade for a handful of questions. Inside the lab, the air met my cheeks with that familiar layered breath, warm near the lamp, cool along the floor, a draft drifting across my ankles, as if to remind me that weather has no use for walls. The lamp's glow trembled slightly when I brushed past it, a soft flicker that settled when I pressed the chain, and the bulb found its steady hum. My coat slipped from my shoulders into its waiting place on the back of the stool, the hem leaving small damp circles on the old wood where melted snow gathered and vanished without fuss. The notebook rested open where I left it, my pencil balanced along its spine, the page curling slightly where my last words waited, half question, half promise. I traced that curve with my fingertip, listening to the creak of the rafters above, the faint tick of the backward clock that refused to accept the notion of forward, the wind scratching its soft argument against the stubborn window that still would not seal. I liked that stubbornness, the way the air insisted on slipping inside to remind me that what I studied was never truly outside, but always breathing here beside me. Tonight the telescope stood idle, its barrel turned slightly away from the window, as if it too knew the clouds had folded the stars into a blanket thicker than the lens could pierce. I did not mind, I let my palm rest on its cold metal skin anyway, feeling the faint tremor of my own pulse echo back through the steel, a small proof that looking does not always need to reveal, sometimes it only needs to remind. I stepped to the cabinet, instead drawn again to the vials, the tiny storm sealed in glass and wax lined like soft-spoken secrets waiting for a hand to lift them to the lamp's glow. I chose one at random, its label rubbed thin by time, its wax chipped at the edge where another thumb had tested its seal decades before. I turned it slowly, watching the liquid catch the light in a sliver of reflected warmth that danced along the curved glass. I did not open it, I never did, but tonight the thought hovered closer than before, what it would mean to crack the seal and let that trap moment of rain or melt or thaw breathe the same air that now turned my breath to mist when I leaned too close to the window. I set the vial down beside the notebook and found my pencil again, the wood warm where my fingers had pressed it last. The page waited without judgment, its empty lines like shallow drifts waiting to hold the shape of each word that might land and melt and change the texture of its hush. I wrote about the way the snow rests on branches until the wind finds the right gust to lift it free, how for a heartbeat the air fills with the shimmer of falling white only to settle again on the path, on the roof, on the curve of the observatory dome that watches without blinking. I wrote about the river beneath its winter skin, how the current does not sleep, but slows its voice into a murmur that carries pebbles and memory beneath the ice where no eye can follow, but every ear can imagine. I pressed the pencil harder against the grain, letting it catch when my thoughts stumbled before drifting again into loops that might have been sketches if they were more sure of themselves, but instead remained almost shaped small, weather systems caught on the edge of language. When my wrist grew tired, I set the pencil down and leaned back, feeling the stool shift beneath me, the creak of old wood echoing into the hush, like a question that did not need answering. I let my eyes drift along the walls where scraps of paper pinned to corkboards curled at the edges, yellowed by years of lamp heat, and the breath of countless seasons that slipped through the window's stubborn gap. Each note was a reminder that someone stood here before me with the same gentle ache in their chest, the same need to listen for the slow voice of the sky caught in the hush of old beams and the drift of dust. I liked imagining those hands, their careful script, the way they must have paused to lift their eyes from ink to cloud to wind, tracing the shapes they could hold and letting the rest slip through ungrasped but not unnoticed. I rose and crossed to the window, pressing my palm flat against the frost that rent the glass, feeling the cold gather beneath my skin in a bloom that made my breath catch when I drew it back. Beyond the pane the trees stood wrapped in snow, their dark trunks striped with drifting white, the wind pulling soft threads of powder from their limbs to scatter along the ridge. Somewhere beneath that hush the earth waited, not dead, but dreaming, storing the hush in its roots, the promise of thaw tucked deep beneath bark and frozen soil. I wondered if the snow knew it would not last, if each flake carried a memory of the cloud it fell from, and the warmth that would carry it back again, when spring loosened the tight knot of winter's quiet fist. By the time the snow softened into a light drifting mist, the path behind the dome felt less like a trail and more like a breath pressed gently into the earth, a hush that gave under my boots with just enough sound to remind me I was moving through it and not above it. The air tonight carried a warmth so slight it only made itself known when I pulled my scarf away from my mouth and tasted the damp where my breath met the slow melt that hovered just above the surface of each branch, each step, each bare patch of stone that peeked through the thinning crust. I paused near the observatory dome, my hand brushing the metal that felt softer somehow under this milder air, as if the frost that once clung so fiercely had decided to slip back into the sky for a while to watch from above. I like to think of frost as a patient visitor drifting down when the night called it, coming and going with no need to explain where it waited in the hours it left the ground uncovered. I pressed my palm flat to the dome's curved side and closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the faint echo of my pulse meet the slow calm cold of iron and sky woven together. Inside the lab the air was still as ever, holding the memory of the lamp's warmth and the faint drift that slipped through the stubborn window's crack, tracing a cool path across the back of my hands when I pulled the chain and let the bulb bloom into its soft glow. My coat landed on the stool's back, its sleeves brushing against the table's edge just enough to shift the notebook waiting there half open to the last page where my pencil had left its faint lines drifting like a thought that paused mid-sentence to listen for something that might finish it. I let my fingertip find the last word I had written, tracing its curve with a quiet respect one gives to something that knows how to wait without growing restless. I closed my eyes again, listening for the sound of the lab's bones settling, the rafters shifting with a small sigh, the clock arguing with itself in its slow backward drift, the wind nudging the window latch in gentle taps that made the glass hum like a low note from a hidden instrument. Tonight, I did not reach for the telescope, though it waited with its barrel aimed toward the corner of sky where the clouds had pulled themselves apart just enough to let one or two small stars slip through like shy thoughts testing the edge of the dark. Instead, I crossed to the cabinet and opened the drawer where the small envelopes of sand and grit rested like the tiny held breath of places I would never stand. I chose one by feel its weight a soft surprise in my palm, and held it up to the lamp, letting the light slip along the thin paper that turned almost translucent where the grains inside pressed against its skin. I thought about how each grain had moved through wind and sun in time before being gathered by a hand I would never shake, sealed with wax that had grown brittle and yellow with seasons I could not name. I did not open it, but I turned it over slowly, listening to the whisper inside that was not sound but memory, a faint dry hush that spoke of heat and wind and the small patient power of drift that makes dunes from nothing more than the air's quiet insistence. I tucked the envelope into the curve of my notebook's spine and let my pencil find the page again, pressing its soft point into the waiting paper without needing to know exactly what came next. The words moved like water, at first slow and uncertain, curling back on themselves as if testing the grain of the page, then finding their way forward sentence by sentence, carrying with them the hush of the lamp, the whisper of sand, the faint pulse of melt drifting through the trees beyond the wall. I wrote about the strange kindness of thaw, the way snow releases its hold not with drama, but with a soft giving, the way icicles let go drop by drop, marking the hours with tiny echoes that find their way into gutters and streams, and the dark soil that waits with such patient hunger beneath the hard frost. I thought about how even now, under the thin skin of lingering snow, the roots of the pines and maples and brittle grasses were stirring just enough to remind themselves that warmth would come back, that light would spill across the ridge again in a flood that asked no permission to wake what had been sleeping. When my hand grew tired, I set the pencil down and leaned back, feeling the stool's legs shift on the old wood, the sound folding into the hush like a footstep into deep snow, disappearing as soon as it landed. The lamp flickered once when the wind found its way through the window gap, but settled again with a low hum that felt as steady as my breath. I let my eyes wander to the vials lined in their shallow tray, the sealed drops of storms and thaw and mist that someone had trusted enough to keep still for years. I wondered if the water inside them remembered the cloud it fell from the leaf it brushed on its way down the patch of earth it might have fed had it not been lifted and poured through glass and wax and careful hands. I wondered if the air inside the tiny pocket above the liquid held the same questions I did, small thoughts bumping against the glass, looking for a crack that might let them out to drift among the dust motes and lamp glow of this quiet room. I stood and crossed to the window, pressing my palm flat against the pane where the frost had pulled back, leaving only a faint blur of breath when I leaned close enough for my exhale to cloud the view. Beyond the glass, the trees leaned together in the mild night, their branches letting go of small clumps of snow that fell without sound into the soft drift below. I imagined the river still moving beneath its crust of ice, slower now, but never truly still, its water carrying the memory of hills and rain and small fallen leaves pressed flat against stones that waited for the thaw to lift them free. I thought about how thaw is not a breaking but a loosening, how the grip of cold slips so gently that you almost do not notice until the trickle finds your boot or the damp finds your sleeve, reminding you that stillness is only ever a pause, not an end. I returned before the path had given up its last layer of frost, before the sun had found the courage to warm the ridge enough to send the snow running in thin silver streams down toward the river that still slept beneath its crust of ice. The world smelled different in the early thaw, damp and raw, as if the earth itself had been holding its breath for too long and now released it in slow, shallow exhalations that drifted along the edge of the trail to brush my ankles and remind me that this hush would not hold forever. I liked the soft betrayal of it, the way each step cracked the thin film of ice hidden under the top crust of snow, the way the sound seemed louder than it should in the quiet morning. The observatory dome waited, as always, its ribs bare in places now where the snow had slipped free, leaving dark streaks that caught the faint gleam of sun that made its first shy appearance through the drift of clouds. I rested my hand on the metal, letting it steal the warmth from my glove, and wondered if somewhere deep inside that cold skin the old lens still dreamed of stars, the way the river dreamed of open sky when its surface still held the weight of winter. Inside the lab the warmth was a soft light pressed thin around the lamps, steady glow drifting down from the bulb in a quiet circle that barely touched the corners of the room, where shadows held their own patient thaw. I set my coat on the stool and ran my fingers along the back of it, feeling how the wood had grown smoother under the weight of all these nights, all these small rituals of arrival and departure. The notebook lay waiting, its cover soft at the edges where my palm had rested so many times, the pencil balanced along its spine, like a thought that might slip if I did not catch it soon enough. I turned the cover open and let the last page remind me where I had stopped, how the words had drifted off just as the snow drifts outside had begun to slip from the branches to land in quiet mounds at the base of each tree. I traced the final curve of my last sentence, then let my hand rest flat against the paper, feeling the faint tremble in my fingers settle into the grain, as if the hush of the lab had found its way into my skin once more. I did not light the stove tonight, though the air nipped at the base of my neck each time the wind found its way through the window gap that never fully gave up its right to open the room to the outside world. I liked that reminder, the way the cold edge of the wind carried the smell of wet bark and thawing needles brushing against the warmth that lived near the lamp, as if to say nothing here truly stays inside no matter how many walls we build. The telescope stood pointed at the window, but tonight it looked more like a figure caught mid-breath, frozen in a moment of quiet longing for the clear sky that would come soon enough, when the clouds gave up their hold and drifted off to gather somewhere else. I brushed my hand along its barrel and imagined the soft click of the old gears if I turned it just so, the faint resistance that came with age and rust and memory stitched into metal and glass. I crossed to the cabinet and opened the drawer where the slides rested, their thin glass edges pressing against each other in neat rows that had not shifted in all the nights I had lifted and returned them. I chose one almost at random, though something in the faint smear of frost across its surface drew my eye more than the others, and I held it to the lamp, letting the light find the trapped shape inside, a snowflake from a storm long forgotten by the world beyond these walls, but alive here still in the thin, stubborn clarity of frozen water and careful hands. I like to think the flake did not mind being held that way, suspended forever in glass and air and thin memories that drifted in the hush each time I lifted it to the light. I set it down beside the notebook, careful of its edges, and wrote a line about how small things carry the sky inside them, how a flake might hold a whole season in its arms, if only for a breath, before it lands and gives itself up to the river, the soil, the waiting route. When I paused to listen, the lab gave back its usual soft chorus, the backward clock ticking its refusal of the forward, the lamps hum steady, and low the creak of a board near the window where the wind leaned in, as if trying to read my words before they found their full shape. I wrote about the river too, about how somewhere beneath the thinning ice its water pressed against the cold shell with no anger, only a quiet certainty that soon it would slip free to carry bits of bark and old leaves and maybe even a scrap of paper that blew too far from my pocket, drifting all the way from the lab door to the low bend where the current slowed enough to gather small forgotten things. I wondered if the water missed the sky when it lived under the ice, or if it remembered the shape of clouds by the faint reflections that managed to slip through the cracks when the sun found the right angle to remind it what light felt like. My hand grew tired, so I set the pencil down and leaned back, letting my eyes drift to the cabinet's lower shelf where the vials of sealed rain rested in their tray, each one a soft promise that even what falls will wait if given the right bottle, the right wax, the right faith, that someone will want to lift it into the lamp circle long after the storm that made it has been forgotten by the ridges and the valley below. I lifted one and turned it slowly, feeling the liquid shift inside, a quiet hush that needed no sound to remind me that weather is never gone, only waiting for the right warmth, the right hand, the right whisper to wake it. I imagined cracking the wax and letting that old rain touch the lab's dry air, watching it slip free as a drop on the wood, catching the light for a heartbeat before it sank into the grain and vanished again, carried by the warmth of the room into the breath I let out when I leaned closer. I did not open it tonight, but I let it rest near the stone I had left on the table, its surface still holding the faint warmth from the last time my palm had cupped it, like a question I had not needed to speak aloud. The stone and the vial side by side, one shaped by water, one holding it, a small reminder that weather wears its memory in so many shapes we pretend not to notice until we hold them still enough to listen. I returned to the window and pressed my forehead to the cold glass, letting my breath bloom across it until the frost softened under the warmth, then slipped back again when I stepped away. Outside, the branches dripped in slow rhythms, the hush broken now and then by the soft drop of water landing in snow, with a sound so small I might have missed it if I did not know how to listen. The thaw did not come all at once, but in careful breaths, as if the ridge itself were testing how much warmth it could hold without waking too fast from its long hush. When I returned to the path, I found the snow shrinking back from the edges where last year's grass pressed forward, pale and matted and ready to lift its head again when the sun decided to stay a little longer each day. The air carried that soft, wet scent of things that had been held still for too long and now shifted restlessly under the surface, waiting for the right word to release them. I paused near the observatory dome and brushed my palm over the patch of metal exposed where the frost had lost its hold. It felt less like touching cold iron and more like pressing my hand to the back of something waking up slowly, remembering that warmth can find even the deepest seam if given enough time. The trees around me dropped small beads of melt from their branches, which fell through the air without hurried landing in shallow pools along the path that mirrored the sky in broken pieces. The sound was not loud, but it gathered in my chest as I stood there, letting the chill slip into my sleeves and remind my skin that seasons do not change all at once, but by patient degrees and small forgettings. Inside the lab, the air felt different too, as if the drafts that used to slip through the stubborn window were now softened by the mild push of warmer currents that found their way around the edges of the glass. I left my coat on the back of the stool, and it did not feel like shedding an armor tonight, but more like setting down a question that no longer needed an answer right away. The lamp's chain gave its usual soft click, and the bulb bloomed into its steady circle of hush, catching the edges of the notebook where I had left it open to the last place my pencil had drifted. I brushed my palm across the page, careful not to smudge the words still soft with the oil of my fingertips, the graphite catching the glow in faint silvery lines that reminded me of thin veins of meltwater threading their way through the last drifts outside the lab walls. I closed my eyes for a moment and listened to the ceiling breathe the soft groan of beams adjusting to the change, the backward clock muttering its old argument with time that had nothing to do with spring or thaw or drift. I turned to the telescope out of habit more than expectation, its barrel angled toward the part of the sky that hid behind a thin wash of cloud tonight, where a single star might press through if the wind pushed the cover aside for a heartbeat. I leaned close anyway, pressing my eye to the cold ring of the eyepiece, and finding only the blur of a sky not yet decided on how open it wished to be. It did not matter. The comfort lay in the act itself, the quiet ritual of pressing my breath into glass, and letting my thoughts stretch outward into spaces my hands would never reach. I pulled back, and let my palm rest on the curve of the barrel, feeling the faint tremor of my pulse meet the steady hush of metal that had held so many other pulses before mine, each one leaning close for a better glimpse, a better question, a better promise that the sky was not so far if you looked with the right kind of patience. Tonight, I opened the lower drawer in the cabinet, the one that held a shallow box of small notes tucked among the vials and slides and folded scraps of maps that someone had once sketched with a pencil that must have looked very much like mine. I lifted one of the scraps and unfolded it with a care reserved for something that might vanish if handled too roughly. The paper was thin and soft at the edges, its fibers loosened by age and the hush of nights when no hand reached for it. In faint ink a line ran across the center, a simple question drifting there with more space around it than words within it. How far does the wind remember? I read it twice, letting my eyes drift along the uneven curl of the letters, the way they leaned forward as if caught in a breeze themselves. I did not return it to the box right away, but carried it with me to the table, setting it beside the open notebook, where the pencil waited balanced on the spine, like a bird unsure where to land. I wrote beneath that question, letting the pencil move without hurry, the tip catching the grain of the page in tiny snags that slowed my hand just enough to make each word feel like a step pressed carefully into soft new ground. Maybe the wind remembers by touch how it slips around trunks and rocks, how it lifts flakes of bark and shivers loose the old leaves pressed flat under snow. Maybe it remembers by voice, the way it carries the creek's thawing song across the ridge, or the soft hiss of pine needles brushing against each other in the dark. Maybe the wind does not remember at all, but moves because standing still is not what it knows how to do. My pencil paused on that thought, hovering over the last word until the hush of the lab folded around it, holding the line in place, like a shallow pool that reflects the sky without asking it to stay. I stood and crossed to the window, pressing my palm flat against the glass, feeling how the cold did not bite the same way tonight, but rested there, as if it too were deciding how long to linger before slipping back into the higher branches to wait for dusk. Beyond the pane the trees shifted in the soft pull of wind that found its way between them, carrying small flecks of bark and the scent of melt and earth waking up. I liked the idea that the wind could slip through the crack by the latch, find my notebook, and carry my words outward piece by piece, lifting the graphite into the branches where it might rest for a while before drifting away again to places I would never stand. I pulled my palm away and watched the patch of warmth bloom and fade, the frost gone now from the glass, replaced by the thin film of condensation that caught the lamp's glow in a soft arc before slipping back to clear when the draft pushed through again. I returned to the table and laid the old scrap of paper back in its box, folding it along the same crease someone else had made when their night in this room drifted to its own quiet close. I let my fingers rest for a heartbeat on the edge of the box before sliding the drawer shut, hearing the soft click of wood against wood, the same click that must have marked the end of countless nights here, each one folding another small hush into the bones of the lab. I pressed my hand flat on the table's surface, feeling the grain catch at my skin like the rough tongue of bark waking under the first true breath of spring. I did not write again tonight, but I let my pencil rest across the spine of the notebook, its tip touching the last line I had drawn, so that when I returned it would not feel so far from where my thought had paused. The path behind the dome was softer now, where the snow had thinned to patches that clung stubbornly to the shadows of the trees, and the hollows where last year's leaves had drifted into shallow pockets waiting for the melt to lift them free. Each step found earth in places that had not felt the warmth of a boot in months, the soft give of thawed ground carrying my weight, as if testing its own strength against my quiet insistence on returning again and again to the same hidden door that never asked why I came, only opened with its patient sigh to let me slip inside. The air tonight held a promise I could taste on the back of my tongue, a thin sweetness, like sap rising through trunks still bare of leaves, but awake enough now to remember what it means to feed themselves from root to branch. When I paused at the dome, I pressed my palm flat against its cool curve, and found that the frost was gone entirely, no trace of its glassy grip, only the faint damp of condensation that caught the dim spill of light from the ridge where the sun had dropped an hour before, but still lingered in the hush between dusk and night. I wondered if the dome ever longed for its old purpose, for the weight of an eye at its lens, the soft adjustments of hands turning dials, to chase the arc of a star across the vast hush overhead. Maybe it was enough to stand here half hidden by branches holding the memory of all the skies it had once gathered inside its ribs. Inside the lab the warmth felt different tonight, more alive somehow, as if the thaw outside had slipped beneath the sill and the gap in the window, and curled itself around the legs of the table, and the slope of the old stool, waiting to greet my ankles with its shy breath. The lamp's glow spread wide tonight, catching dust motes that drifted like tiny seeds caught in a draft, looking for somewhere soft to land. My coat fell from my shoulders without a thought, finding its place on the back of the stool, where the fabric brushed against the notebook that lay open to the page I had left waiting, a faint curl in the corner where the air had lifted it once or twice, as if reminding the paper not to sleep too deeply between my visits. I rested my palm flat on the open page, feeling how the grain of the paper caught at my skin the way thawed earth catches at the sole of a boot, pulling gently, as if to say, stay a little longer, let your warmth sink in. My pencil waited across the spine, its point dull from nights of drifting lines and small looping words that did not always ask to be read, only written down, so they would not vanish entirely when the hush returned. Tonight, I did not reach for the telescope, though its barrel stood steady near the window, tilted toward a slice of sky that showed no stars, only the thick sweep of cloud that pressed down close enough that I imagined I could touch it if I leaned far enough through the glass. Instead, I moved to the cabinet, where the vials rested, each one cradling a drop of weather that someone long before me had trusted enough to seal away with wax and glass, believing that to keep a thing still was not the same as stopping it, only asking it to wait until the right pair of hands came along to lift it back into the breath of the room. I chose one near the edge, its wax darker than the others, the glass clouded just enough that I could not see clearly through the liquid inside. I turned it gently between my fingers, listening to the soft hush of its movement, the way the drop inside found its edges, and let go over and over in a patient loop that matched the rhythm of my own breath as I stood there with my shoulder pressed to the cabinet's frame. I thought about opening it just enough to free that piece of sky back into the air where my breath would carry it toward the ceiling beams and the spaces behind the shelves where dust had settled in the shape of seasons long gone. But I did not open it, not yet. I set it carefully on the table beside the notebook and watched how the lamp's glow caught the curve of glass, throwing a thin line of light across the page like a river in miniature tracing its way through the drift of words I had left waiting. I let my pencil find the page, and wrote about the river too, how I imagined its skin of ice cracking whiter each day under the slow push of meltwater, how each break let the sky slip inside to wake the stones resting on the riverbed, brushing them clean with a gentle hush of flow that had been held back so long it did not rush, but move with the careful certainty of something that knows it will reach the sea eventually. I wrote about the roots of the trees pressing deeper now, tugged by that same thaw, the thin threads of water carrying memory from last year's storms into this year's buds, that would soon crack open into leaves if only the warmth held steady for a handful of days. When my hand tired, I let the pencil rest across the open page again, its point hovering above the words as if listening for what might come next when I returned. I crossed to the window and pressed my fingertips to the glass, feeling how the chill no longer bit at my skin but settled there in a quiet agreement with the warmth beneath my nails, a promise that soon enough the air outside and the air inside would find the same breath and drift through this room without needing permission from the stubborn gap by the latch. Beyond the glass the branches swayed in a slow arc, brushing each other with a hush like pages turning somewhere just out of reach. I closed my eyes and let that sound slip into my ears, carrying with it the memory of last winter's storms, the quiet snap of frost on needles, the deep hush of drifts so thick they buried my footsteps before I reached the door again. I opened my eyes and found the thaw waiting there too, in the dark spaces between trunks where melt pooled in shallow hollows, catching the faint glow of the lab's lamp thrown back at me in tiny trembling reflections. The path was different under my boots tonight, softer at first where the thaw had found its way through the top layer of old snow, leaving behind pockets of damp earth that released the faint smell of last year's fallen needles, and the promise of something green not yet awake, but close enough to touch if I pressed my ear to the ground and listened. Each step made a sound. I had almost forgotten the slow pull of mud against the sole, the gentle squelch that felt like breathing in a different language, one spoken in the dark between the last frost and the first buds. I paused near the dome, letting my glove rest on the curve of its metal ribs, which were bare now except for the fine beads of moisture that clung there like tiny mirrors, catching the faint glow of a sky that could not quite decide if it wished to clear or hold its cloud cover a little longer. There was a warmth in that metal tonight, not true warmth, but the echo of sun stored in iron and released slowly as dusk gave way to the hush that followed me up the last rise to the lab's door. Inside the air felt the same and different all at once, a hush familiar yet edged with something looser, as if the draft through the window had learned to speak more kindly now that the cold behind it was not so sharp. The lamp bloomed into its circle of soft gold the moment my fingers found the chain, and the dust motes drifted into view like tiny notes on an invisible page, shifting with each breath I exhaled. My coat found the back of the stool without protest, and the wood beneath it remembered my shape as I brushed my hand along the edge, feeling the faint grit of a splinter that had not worked itself loose despite all my passing touch. The notebook waited open, its page curled faintly at the corner where the air had caught it enough to lift and set it back down like a question half formed, then left for me to finish. I traced the last line I had written with my fingertip, then let my palm settle flat against the paper, feeling how it gave slightly under my weight the way thawed ground yields, but never truly breaks apart. I left the pencil resting where it was, and crossed to the window, pressing my palm flat against the glass. There was no frost tonight, only a thin veil of condensation that bloomed beneath my skin, then retreated when the draft found its way along the seam by the latch. Beyond the glass the trees were still, though every so often a branch slipped free of a bead of melt that fell through the air to land below with a sound so soft I would have missed it if not for the hush that waited here to hold each drop like a note in a song too patient to rush itself to an ending. I thought about how the branches must feel the slow pull of sap rising inside them, a silent promise that green would come again to the tips that now only scratched at the dark sky like thin fingers searching for a hand to press back against their reach. Tonight, I did not open the cabinet or lit the vials, though I let my eyes drift across the shape of the tray where each sealed drop of weather rested, waiting for my curiosity to lift it back into the lamp's glow. Instead, I returned to the table and let my hand find the stone that had kept its place beside the notebook, its weight unchanged but its surface now warm, where the air had settled around it in the hush of all my absences. I turned it slowly, feeling the grip press into my skin, and the smooth side remind me that every rough edge wears down in time if water, or wind, or human touch asks softly enough. I thought about how this stone had traveled here, how many hands might have lifted it before mine, how many pockets it had rested inside, how many streams had carried it forward before leaving it on a bend in the river for someone to find and slip into a bag that would one day open here in this room that smelled faintly of old paper and would warmed by the lamp's circle of gold. I set the stone down and lifted the pencil, letting its dull point hover above the page while my breath evened itself out in the hush. The backward clock marked each second not forward but backward in the way it always had, a slow reminder that here time did not argue for the future but folded itself gently into the drift that held my words, and the dust and the air that never stopped moving around my ankles. I wrote about the river under its broken skin of ice, how the meltwater must feel as it slips across stones still cold from months pressed tight against winter's hush, how each drop carries the sky with it, even in darkness, threading its way past roots and banks toward bends that wait without asking for permission to curb the current's will. I wrote about the sky too, how I liked to imagine it slipping lower each night, pressing its breath against the tops of the trees, and the domes curved back to remind me that distance is never so vast when you stand still long enough to feel the hush between stars and soil. When my wrist grew tired, I laid the pencil down and sat back, listening to the draft push a soft breath through the window's gap, just enough to lift the edge of a loose page pen to the corkboard above the sink. It fluttered once, then settled again, as if reminded that here even small movements have no need to prove themselves loud enough to be believed. I let my eyes drift across the old notes, tacked there yellowed at the corners, curling where steam and cold had taken turns tugging at the edges through seasons I had never seen, but could feel pressed into the grain of the table beneath my forearms. Somewhere in those scraps were questions written by hands I would never know, questions that did not need answers so much as witnesses, questions that still waited in the hush each time I turned the lamp's chain and let the glow spill across them like a voice whispered into the rafters for the beams to carry long after I had stepped back into the thaw. I stood and moved to the window again, pressing my forehead against the glass until the warmth of my skin made the condensation bloom outward in a halo that blurred the view beyond the pane. I watched a branch shift under the weight of a bird. I could not quite see its wings catching what little light slipped between the trees before it lifted away silent as a breath given back to the night. I thought about how every thaw leaves behind something small to mark its passing, a pool in the hollow of a root, a stone turned to show its smoother side, a patch of ground where last year's leaf lifts just enough to catch the promise of what will push through when the sun decides it is safe to stay for more than a brief conversation at the edge of dusk. The thaw had settled into the bones of the path so completely now that I no longer felt the soft betrayal of ice under my boots, but only the patient give of damp earth holding the shape of each step before letting it fade again into the hush behind me. The trees had begun to lean into their new breath, the tips of their branches catching the faint glow of a sky that promised more light than it gave tonight, but still carried the scent of warmth in its drift. I paused by the dome as I always did, letting my palm press flat against the curve of its ribs, which felt less like metal than the skin of something alive, and resting beneath the patient hush of cloud cover and drifting mist. No frost gathered there now, only a scatter of droplets that clung to my glove when I lifted my hand away, tiny mirrors that caught the lamp's promise waiting up ahead in the old lab, that breathed through its seams like a living thing, remembering every question I had carried across this softened ground. Inside the lab the air held the warmth with more certainty tonight, drifting down from the lamp's gentle spill to gather around my ankles and slip through the seams of my sleeves, as if the hush here knew how to find every small place the wind might once have claimed. My coat landed on the stool's back without thought, my shoulder brushing the edge where the wood had grown smooth under nights like this, where I settled my weight and let the grain hold it without protest. The lamp's chain gave its soft click, and the bulb bloomed the way the first pale leaves will soon bloom from tips of branches that now only dream of green behind the hush of their bare skin. The notebook waited open, its page lifting faintly as the warm air drifted through the stubborn gap in the window, where the draft now felt less like intrusion and more like the gentle promise that the outside and the inside here had always agreed to share the same breath. I let my palm rest flat on the page before I lifted the pencil, feeling the dull point press into the soft grain without hurry, the way a boot presses into thawed earth just enough to remember its own weight. I did not write right away, but let my eyes drift to the stone that waited near the edge of the table, its rough side catching the lamp's glow, its smooth side dark, where the shadow gathered around it like water around a bend in the river that still slipped beneath its thinning skin of ice. I thought about that river tonight, how it must feel the thaw pressing against its spine, the stones on its bed shifting ever so slightly with each drop of meltwater that joined its hush. I thought of the old storms gathered in the sealed vials tucked away in the cabinet, each one a promise that no drop of sky is ever truly lost, only waiting for the right warmth to crack the wax and let it breathe again through the dust and lamp glow of this small room that asks nothing but patience in return for its hush. I lifted the pencil then, and let the words drift into the waiting lines, tracing the shape of the thaw that I could feel under my feet each time I stepped off the path, and let the ground remind me how soft the world can be when it decides to loosen its hold. I wrote about the branches above the dome, how they would soon wear their thin veils of green, and catch the wind in a new voice that rustled instead of cracked, how that voice would slip through the open window and braid itself into the breath of the lab, so the hush here would no longer belong only to wood and dust, but to leaves and drifting seeds, and the slow hum of insects remembering the shape of warm air. My pencil paused, then pressed again, to catch the thought of the sky above this place, how it would slip its pale clouds aside soon enough to scatter stars across the dome's curved eye, once more waiting for me to lean close to the cold ring of the eyepiece and find a flicker of light older than any question I could hold in my small hands. When my wrist grew tired, I set the pencil down and crossed to the window, letting my palm find the glass that now gave back more warmth than cold, as if the hush outside had begun to trust that this season might hold steady for a while before the next drift of chill found its way back down from the ridge. The trees beyond the pane leaned together in the hush, their branches tracing slow arcs in the faint breeze that slipped between their trunks, carrying the smell of thawed bark and old needles, and the promise of roots waking beneath the surface. I closed my eyes and let my forehead rest against the glass just long enough to feel my breath bloom there, and fade again, to clear, leaving behind only the faint circle of warmth that slipped away the moment I stepped back. I turned then to the cabinet, and lifted one vial from its resting place. The wax along its neck cracked just enough to show how many seasons it had waited here without complaint. I held it to the lamp, and watched the thin line of liquid inside catch the light in a tiny tremble that matched the pulse in my palm. I thought about opening it now, about letting the drop of old weather slip back into the hush of this room, to meet the breath of new thaw drifting through the window, but I did not break the seal. Instead, I set it beside the stone near the notebook where the pencil waited across the spine, its point turned toward the next line, not yet written, but already alive somewhere behind the hush that filled the rafters, and the corners, and the space between my shoulder and the warm wood of the stool. I brushed my fingertips across the stone, then across the vial, and then across the page, as if reminding each of them that this moment would hold only as long as I let it, and that the hush would keep it all safe when I slipped back out into the soft pull of the path. I thought then of the observatory dome, its ribs pressed against the rising warmth the way a shell holds the memory of water long after the tide has slipped away. I imagined it catching the soft rustle of leaves soon enough, the drift of pollen, the hush of a new night sky laid out in patient dots of cold light, waiting for my eye to press close once more to the ring of glass, and find the same old stories written there again in shapes that drift just enough to remind me that nothing stands still forever, no matter how carefully we press wax into cracks or ink into pages.